The war in Europe had ended, but the air inside the room still felt like a front line. Cigarette smoke hung low beneath the chandelier, curling slowly toward the ceiling as if unsure whether it was allowed to rise. The table was long, crowded with uniforms that no longer needed to be crisp, medals that had already done their work, and faces that carried the fatigue of men who had learned how thin the line between victory and collapse really was. Outside, somewhere beyond the walls of the requisition building, Europe was quiet in a way it had not been quiet in 6 years. No artillery, no engines, no alarms. But inside this room, the silence was brittle. Every man present understood that wars did not truly end when the shooting stopped. They ended when the next one began forming. George S. Patton sat slightly apart from the center of the table, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He wore his uniform like armor, not ceremonial, not relaxed, ready. Those who had served near him knew that Patton did not unwind after campaigns. He recalibrated. Victory, to him, was not an ending, but a brief pause where momentum either hardened into advantage or dissolved into hesitation. He had seen too many pauses turn into regrets. His eyes moved slowly across the room, noting who spoke, who laughed too loudly, who drank too eagerly. Celebration, Patton believed, was often just another form of blindness. Across the table sat a Soviet general, broad-shouldered, his uniform heavy with decorations that reflected the light when he shifted in his chair. He had the bearing of a man accustomed to obedience, but also the ease of someone who knew he represented something vast, an army that had bled by the millions, a nation that now stood astride half of Europe. The Red Army had paid dearly for victory, and its officers carried that cost openly, sometimes proudly. This was not a man unused to command, nor to death. When he rose slightly from his chair, lifting his glass, the room instinctively stilled. Conversations faded. The chairs stopped moving. Even the smoke seemed to pause. The general's voice was calm, practiced, and translated smoothly for those who needed it, though many in the room already understood enough to grasp the meaning. He spoke of shared victory, of sacrifice, of enemies crushed between East and West. He spoke of comradeship forged in blood and endurance. His glass rose higher as he spoke, catching the light, the gesture unmistakable. A toast to alliance, to triumph, to the future. Glasses began to lift around the table, some eagerly, some cautiously. It was the expected motion, the safe motion. This was how wars were closed in public, with raised glasses and words that smoothed over what maps and borders could not yet resolve. For a brief moment, it appeared that Patton might do the same. His hand moved, not quickly, not slowly, toward the glass in front of him. The room watched him without appearing to watch. Everyone knew Patton's reputation. Everyone knew his opinions, even if few had ever heard them spoken plainly in such company. Patton's fingers touched the glass, then stopped. The pause was subtle, but unmistakable. The Soviet general noticed first. Then others did. Patton did not raise the glass. He did not look away. His gaze remained steady, fixed not on the glass, but on the man who had offered the toast. When he spoke, his voice was even controlled, carrying just far enough to be heard without forcing the room to listen. What he said was not loud. It did not need to be. It cut through the room, precisely because it was restrained. The translator hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before repeating the words. That hesitation was enough. It signaled that something had shifted, that this was no longer a ceremonial exchange, but a moment where meanings mattered. Patton did not insult. He did not threaten. He did not refuse outright in the way men did when they wanted confrontation. Instead, he reframed the moment. He acknowledged the war that had just ended, but implied another one already forming. He spoke not of celebration, but of caution. Not of unity, but of divergence. His words suggested that victory had arrived faster than understanding, and that raising a glass to the future without agreeing on what that future was might be the most dangerous gesture of all. The room reacted unevenly. Some officers stiffened. Others pretended to sip their drinks while watching over the rim of their glasses. A few smiled thinly, as if humor might still rescue the moment. The Soviet general did not sit back down immediately. He studied Patton carefully, his expression unreadable, his glass still raised. For the first time since the war had ended, the alliance that had defeated Germany felt fragile, less like a bond, more like a truce suspended on etiquette. Patton finally released the glass without lifting it. The soft sound it made as it settled back onto the table seemed louder than it should have been. In that small sound was a signal that would echo far beyond the room. A signal that the war's final chapter had been written, but its conclusion had not been agreed upon. No one would record the exchange formally. No communique would mention it. But men who were present would remember it clearly years later, when borders hardened, when speeches sharpened, when former allies began studying each other the way enemies always do, carefully, quietly, and with calculation. Because in that moment, during a simple toast, something unspoken had become impossible to ignore. The war was over. But peace, Patton had just reminded them, was not the same thing. The silence that followed did not break cleanly. It stretched uneven and uncomfortable, as if the room itself was unsure how to behave now that ceremony had failed. Someone cleared his throat. Another officer finally lowered his glass and took a drink he did not seem to taste. The Soviet general eventually sat back down, his expression composed, but the ease he had carried into the toast was gone. Whatever this evening had been intended to represent, a shared closing of the book on the war, had quietly slipped out of reach. The page had turned, but the ink was still wet, and no one could yet read what came next. To understand why Patton's words landed with such weight, one had to understand where the world stood in that moment. Germany was defeated, its cities in ruins, its army shattered beyond recovery. But the collapse of a common enemy had exposed something far more dangerous than resistance: uncertainty. The Allied coalition had never been a family. It was a structure held together by necessity, by timing, and by fear of something worse. Once that fear vanished, the seams began to show almost immediately. The Soviet Union now occupied vast stretches of Eastern Europe. Its armies were not withdrawing, they were entrenching. American and British planners had begun to notice patterns: rail movements that did not match demobilization schedules, political security, units arriving alongside military governors, borders hardening before treaties were finalized. Reports filtered upward, cautious at first, then increasingly blunt. This was not a partner preparing to stand down. This was a power consolidating gains. Patton had been reading those reports. He read everything. Not casually, not selectively. He treated intelligence, summaries, the way other men treated maps in battle, looking for movement, direction, intent. Where many saw exhausted allies trying to stabilize chaos, Patton saw momentum. He believed momentum, once lost, could rarely be recovered without blood. And he believed the Red Army had no intention of losing it. To Patton, the toast was not just a gesture. It was a test. A ritual designed to lock the narrative in place before anyone could object to it. Raise the glass, agree on the story, move on. That was how post-war myths were born. But Patton had never been comfortable with myths, especially ones that required pretending not to see what was directly in front of him. He believed clarity, even brutal clarity, saved lives in the long run. What troubled him most was not Soviet strength. It was Western hesitation. He had watched Allied leadership grow cautious in the final months of the war, careful not to offend, careful not to provoke, careful not to be the first to say what everyone suspected. Patton despised that kind of caution. In his mind, hesitation was simply to delay wearing a respectable uniform. The Soviet general's toast, for all its polite language, assumed agreement. Agreement that victory meant the same thing to both sides. Agreement that the future would be jointly shaped. Agreement that sacrifices had been equal in intent, if not in scale. Patton rejected that assumption instinctively. He did not believe the Soviet vision of post-war Europe aligned with American interests, values, or long-term security. And he believed pretending otherwise was the first step toward strategic surrender. Yet what made Patton's response remarkable was not its defiance, but its restraint. He could have embarrassed the general publicly. He could have refused outright, made a spectacle of dissent. Instead, he chose precision. He spoke just enough to disrupt the narrative without detonating the room. It was a calculated move, whether conscious or instinctive. He placed doubt on the table and let it sit there, forcing everyone present to acknowledge it. The reaction among the American officers was mixed. Some admired the clarity. Others felt a tightening in their chests, aware that Patton was once again moving faster than policy, faster than diplomacy, faster than Washington. Patton had a history of doing that. He believed battlefield logic applied beyond the battlefield. Politics, to him, was simply war conducted with worse information and weaker language. Across the room, the Soviet delegation began speaking more quietly among themselves. Their body language shifted, less open, more guarded. They had expected deference, perhaps even admiration. Instead, they had encountered resistance where they least expected it. Not in negotiations, not in documents, but in a moment designed to symbolize unity. Later that night, as the gathering dissolved and officers filtered out into the cool air, the incident would be quietly discussed in hallways and staff cars. Some would dismiss it as Patton being Patton, brilliant, abrasive, impossible to contain. Others would note uneasily that he had voiced aloud what many had only whispered, that the alliance had reached its natural limit, that the war's end had not resolved the fundamental question of power. It had simply rearranged it. For Patton, there was no satisfaction in the moment. He did not believe in symbolic victories. He believed in positioning. As he left the building, the sounds of celebration fading behind him, he reportedly remarked to one of his aides that history was already accelerating again, and that men who failed to keep pace would soon find themselves overtaken. He was not wrong. Within months, the language of partnership would give way to suspicion. Intelligence sharing would narrow. Military exercises would be reinterpreted as threats. The lines that had once converged on Berlin would begin pulling in opposite directions. The Cold War would not be declared. It would simply arrive quietly, the way storms do when pressure builds unnoticed. And years later, when analysts and historians searched for the earliest moments when the alliance began to fracture, not in treaties, not in speeches, but in tone, they would return to scenes like this one. A raised glass, a pause, a refusal not of the drink, but of the illusion it represented. Because in that room, Patton had not rejected a toast. He had rejected a future he did not believe in. By the following morning, the toast had already begun to change shape. What had been a brief, contained exchange the night before now existed in fragments, retold with slight alterations depending on who was speaking and who was listening. In some versions, Patton had been merely curt. In others, confrontational. In a few, almost prophetic. This was how moments like these evolved inside military systems, not as fixed events, but as adaptable narratives, molded to fit institutional comfort. Word reached higher headquarters quickly. It always did when Patton was involved. But the reports were careful, stripped of drama, reduced to phrasing that suggested a minor diplomatic irregularity rather than a strategic statement. No one wanted to be responsible for escalating what might still be contained. And containment, more than clarity, had become the guiding principle of post-war command. Eisenhower was briefed later that day. The aide delivering the summary chose his words with care, framing the incident as a moment of tension, rather than an outright challenge. Eisenhower listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, his hands folded. When the aide finished, there was a pause, not of surprise, but of recognition. Eisenhower knew Patton too well to misinterpret what had happened. This had not been an accident. It had been an assertion. What Eisenhower wrestled with was not whether Patton was right. It was whether being right mattered more than being controlled. The war had ended, but Eisenhower's responsibilities had expanded rather than diminished. He was now a stabilizer, not a breaker of lines. His role required him to keep alliances intact long enough for political transitions to take hold. That meant absorbing friction quietly, smoothing edges rather than sharpening them. Patton, by contrast, had never seen value in smoothing anything. He believed sharp edges clarified reality. There was discussion among senior staff about issuing a formal reprimand. Not for content, no one could openly fault Patton's assessment, but for timing and setting. Diplomacy, after all, was supposed to happen in designated rooms, not during ceremonial dinners. But a formal reprimand carried risks. It would confirm to the Soviets that Patton's views were exceptional rather than representative. It would also provoke Patton, who had never responded well to restraint imposed after the fact. In the end, Eisenhower chose neither endorsement nor punishment. He chose distance. Patton was not called in. No memo was issued. No public clarification followed. Instead, future invitations involving Soviet counterparts simply stopped including him. He was shifted quietly toward operational concerns deemed less sensitive. On paper, nothing had changed. In practice, Patton had been gently moved away from the center of post-war diplomacy. Patton noticed immediately. He had spent his entire career reading between lines, orders, maps, conversations. He understood exclusion better than most men understood inclusion. To him, silence was not neutrality. It was written without explanation, and he despised it. Privately, he vented to his staff. Not angrily, but with a kind of exhausted frustration. He believed the war had ended too early, not in terms of fighting, but in terms of thinking. He believed the Allies had stopped asking the most dangerous questions precisely when asking them mattered most. And he believed history would not forgive that hesitation. What troubled him most was not his own marginalization. It was the pattern he saw emerging. Political leaders were already beginning to frame the war as a clean conclusion rather than a transition. Victory parades replaced strategic assessments. Celebrations crowded out contingency planning. The public wanted closure. Governments were eager to provide it. Patton had never trusted closure. Meanwhile, Soviet responses to the incident were measured but unmistakable. Communications became more formal. Less warmth, more protocol. Joint appearances were reduced. Where there had once been gestures of camaraderie, there was now distance, subtle, controlled, intentional. The Soviets understood Patton's refusal not as a personal slight, but as a signal. And signals, in their world, were never ignored. In Moscow, internal reports characterized Patton as ideologically unreliable, a phrase that carried weight far beyond its mild phrasing. He was seen not as a rogue, but as a representative of a strain within American command that viewed the post-war order as unfinished. That assessment would linger long after Patton himself was gone. Back in Washington, policymakers faced an uncomfortable truth. Patton had spoken too early, not incorrectly. His error was not analysis, but timing. He had forced a question the system was not ready to answer. And systems rarely forgive that. Eisenhower, for his part, remained publicly silent. But privately, he began adjusting assumptions. He authorized deeper intelligence collection in Eastern Europe. He approved contingency planning that would later form the backbone of Western defense doctrine. None of this was attributed to Patton. It couldn't be. But the seed had been planted. Years later, Eisenhower would reflect on this period with careful language, describing it as a time when certainty dissolved faster than victory could replace it. He never mentioned the toast. He never mentioned Patton's words. But those who knew him understood what he meant. He had seen the fracture forming even as he worked to keep it from widening. For Patton, the cost of speaking plainly was isolation. But isolation had never frightened him. What frightened him was silence masquerading as peace. He believed that unspoken truths had a way of returning with force, often when preparation had already lapsed. The toast, then, was not an ending. It was an early marker, a moment when two futures briefly overlapped in the same room, and one of them refused to be toasted. And in that refusal, Patton had done what he always did best. He had forced reality to speak first. In the months that followed, the memory of that toast faded from official conversation, but it did not fade from consequence. History has a way of preserving moments not through documentation, but through alignment, when later events seem to bend backward and attach themselves to something small that once felt insignificant. This was one of those moments. At the time, it had been a dinner exchange, a brief pause in ceremony. Later, it would look like an early fracture line. Patton was reassigned again, his authority intact on paper, but narrowed in practice. He was given responsibilities that kept him busy, visible, yet strategically peripheral. The language used around his movements changed. Where earlier reports spoke of command necessity, later ones emphasized administrative suitability. It was the vocabulary of containment. Patton understood it instinctively. He had spent a lifetime studying how armies maneuvered, and he recognized the same principles being applied to him. He wrote in his diary more frequently during this period. The tone shifted. Less triumph, more unease. Not fear, Patton was not afraid, but impatience. He believed the war had clarified rather than resolved the central problem of Europe. Germany had been defeated, yes, but the vacuum left behind had not been neutral. It had been filled immediately, decisively, and without consultation. He worried that the Allies were mistaking exhaustion for peace. What Patton could not say publicly, he said privately, and sometimes recklessly. He spoke of maps that no longer matched reality, of lines that had moved faster than negotiations, of armies that had stopped advancing but had not stopped watching. To Patton, the toast had symbolized something dangerous, a belief that unity could be declared simply by wishing it so. The Soviet general, for his part, returned home and reported the exchange in a very different tone. In his account, Patton's refusal was not rude. It was clear. He described an American commander who understood conflict not as a sequence of wars, but as a continuous condition shaped by power, not sentiment. That assessment circulated quietly within Soviet military circles, reinforcing existing suspicions about American intentions. This dual interpretation, one side downplaying, the other archiving, would become a pattern. As 1946 turned into 1947, the world shifted exactly as Patton had warned it might. Borders hardened. Language cooled. Former allies began speaking in abstractions rather than specifics. Security replaced victory. Influence replaced liberation. The toast that never happened began to look less like a breach of etiquette and more like a refusal to participate in a fiction. Patton did not live to see how fully that fiction unraveled. His death, sudden and unceremonious, removed him from the unfolding narrative just as it began accelerating. Official statements praised his service, his victories, and his role in defeating Nazi Germany. They did not mention his doubts. They did not mention the toast. They did not mention his growing unease with the shape of the peace. But history has a habit of reintroducing inconvenient voices. As the Cold War settled into its early form, analysts began revisiting the immediate post-war period, searching for moments when different choices might have altered trajectories. The focus was often on conferences, treaties, and summits. But occasionally, attention drifted to smaller interactions, unguarded conversations, private remarks, gestures that revealed more than speeches ever could. The toast began to appear in footnotes, then memoirs, then scholarly debate. Not because it changed policy directly, but because it captured a mindset that policy had ignored. Patton had not refused out of disrespect. He had refused out of recognition. He saw, before many others did, that the war's end had not erased competing visions of order. It had simply paused the argument long enough for everyone to catch their breath. Eisenhower, years later, would address this tension obliquely. In his farewell address, he warned of forces that grew strongest not during war, but after it, when vigilance declined and assumptions hardened. Some historians would later suggest that Eisenhower's caution reflected lessons learned not only from global events, but from personal experience. From moments when he had chosen stability over confrontation, knowing the cost might be deferred rather than avoided. The toast, in retrospect, became symbolic of that choice. For Patton, refusing the toast was not an act of defiance against a man or a nation. It was an act of loyalty to his understanding of war. He believed that pretending conflict had ended when its conditions still existed was more dangerous than acknowledging discomfort. To raise a glass, in that moment, would have been to endorse a narrative he believed was incomplete. And so he didn't. The power of the moment lies not in what was said aloud, but in what followed. In the recalibrations. In the silences. In this way institutions adjusted themselves to avoid repeating it. The toast marked a boundary between celebration and caution, between declared peace and emerging rivalry. Most men in that room moved on quickly. Patton did not. Neither, ultimately, did history. Because when alliances fractured, when Europe divided, when the world reorganized itself around suspicion rather than unity, that brief refusal began to look less like an outburst and more like an early diagnosis. A recognition that the war's most consequential phase might not be the one fought with tanks and artillery, but the one negotiated with words that did not quite mean what they claimed. In that sense, the toast was never about courtesy. It was about timing, about whether the world was ready to declare something finished simply because it wanted to be done. Patton wasn't. And in refusing to raise his glass, he left behind a moment that still echoes, not as an insult, but as a warning. The story of that toast survives not because it changed orders or redirected armies, but because it exposed something far rarer in wartime leadership, a moment where instinct ran ahead of consensus. By the time historians began seriously reassessing the early post-war years, Patton's refusal had acquired a different weight. It was no longer examined as a personality quirk or an example of his well-known abrasiveness. It was studied as a signal, quiet, unrecorded in official minutes, yet uncannily aligned with what came next. In the immediate aftermath of Patton's death, the Allied narrative solidified around unity and closure. The war was framed as a conflict decisively ended, its moral clarity preserved by ceremony and memory. The Soviet Union was still publicly referred to as a partner in victory. American generals who expressed unease were advised, sometimes gently, sometimes firmly, to redirect their attention toward rebuilding and demobilization. The world wanted relief, not warnings. Patton would have understood that impulse. He was not immune to fatigue, nor blind to the cost of perpetual readiness. But he believed that relief built on illusion was fragile. His career had taught him that the most dangerous moments in warfare often came after apparent success, when vigilance slipped, when assumptions hardened into doctrine, and when enemies were redefined too late. What troubled him most was not Soviet strength, but Allied complacency. He had watched German officers misread intent, mistake patience for weakness, and confuse diplomacy with delay. Now, he sensed similar patterns forming among his own side. The toast in his mind was not about vodka or victory. It was about premature certainty. The Soviet general's gesture had been genuine within his own framework. To him, shared sacrifice justified shared celebration. But Patton understood that shared sacrifice did not guarantee shared purpose. Two armies could bleed on the same battlefield and still imagine very different futures emerging from it. The glass raised in camaraderie could, under different circumstances, be raised later in defiance. That awareness defined Patton's final months. His conversations grew more guarded in public, more candid in private. He spoke less about Germany and more about positioning, about logistics, about readiness, about how quickly yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's obstacle if interests diverged. These were not calls to action. They were observations. And observations, when they challenge comfort, are often treated as threats. Eisenhower, balancing the immense responsibility of transition, chose caution. He believed that stability required restraint, that the fragile peace could not withstand open disagreement among victors. From his perspective, Patton's instincts were not wrong, but they were mistimed. The world needed consolidation before confrontation, even if confrontation eventually proved inevitable. History has not fully settled that debate. What it has settled is this: the lines hardened exactly where Patton believed they would. Eastern Europe slipped behind an ideological curtain. Former coordination turned into surveillance. Military cooperation gave way to arms races, proxy conflicts, and decades of strategic tension. None of this happened because of a toast, but the toast captured, in miniature, the divergence that made it all possible. In later years, Soviet archives revealed how closely Patton had been studied. His movements, his statements, even his silences were analyzed. He was seen as unpredictable, dangerous, and, perhaps most unsettling, clear-eyed. To Soviet planners, his refusal to play along signaled that not all American commanders accepted the post-war narrative at face value. That perception lingered long after his death. For American audiences, Patton became something else entirely, a symbol of relentless aggression, blunt speech, and uncompromising will. Films emphasized his battlefield ferocity. Biographies debated his flaws. But rarely did they linger on moments like the toast, moments of restraint rather than excess, of refusal rather than action. Yet it is often refusal that reveals belief most clearly. By not raising his glass, Patton chose not to endorse a story he felt was incomplete. He did not interrupt the dinner. He did not argue policy. He simply declined to participate in a moment he believed history would revisit with regret. That choice, understated and easily dismissed at the time, gained meaning only because subsequent events traced its outlines so precisely. Today, the toast reads like a quiet hinge in history, a place where two interpretations of victory briefly touched and then diverged. One saw an end. The other saw a transition. One wanted celebration. The other demanded vigilance. Neither interpretation was irrational, but only one anticipated what followed. Patton never claimed to predict the future. He did not speak in absolutes. What he trusted was a pattern, how power behaved when unchecked, how alliances shifted under pressure, how wars rarely ended cleanly, but instead dissolved into something colder, slower, and more enduring. The room that night did not erupt. No one stormed out. There was no dramatic confrontation, just a pause, a glass left untouched, and an understanding felt more than spoken. That victory had solved one problem while exposing another. That is why the moment endures. Not because it altered the course of the war, but because it captured the instant when the war's shadow stretched forward into the peace. When celebration brushed against caution. When history, for a brief second, revealed itself not in gunfire or speeches, but in what one man chose not to say. The toast was offered in hope. It was refused in awareness. And in that refusal, George S. Patton left behind one of the clearest signals of the world that was already forming quietly, relentlessly, just beyond the end of the war.